In the Coyoacan district of Mexico City, at 247 London Street, is a blue house nestled in a shaded garden. A warm kitchen covered, nearly overrun, with earthenware and pottery. In the bedroom is a huge bed, somewhat frightening despite its flower-edged, heart-shaped pillow. It is the temple of love of a mythical couple, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. A couple whose earth-shattering passion constantly fluctuated between peaks of total happiness and utter distress. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were to have a destiny filled with drama, but also by a passion for art. They were Mexico's most popular artists and made their couple an iconic duo beyond all borders.
They created their love the same way they created their artwork, I think.
Beautiful and rebellious, Frida Kahlo has become a true icon today.
Frida Kahlo is an original artist, an artist whom people identify with today because of her handicap, her audacity, and because she made the way she dressed into a work of art.
Frida wore her defects like a flag. For example, the fuzz above her lips and the bushy eyebrows. Her sculptural beauty now incarnates the image of a woman who claimed proudly, "Take me as I am." And fashion designers, feminist activists, and contemporary artists quickly made her into a muse.
Frida Mania has helped bring about an important thing, the re-evaluation of women and the role of women and society.
As for Diego Rivera, many have forgotten him today, but he is unquestionably one of the founders of muralist art in Mexico. His huge frescoes on the walls of public buildings shaped the education of an entire people after the Mexican Revolution.
Diego Rivera was extremely famous, you see. He was what we will now call a star, so his every move was followed closely.
When we look at his frescoes, we understand that they are an essential part of our artistic heritage.
Never has another passion so deserved to be called all-consuming and unconditional than that of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. Yet it was a passion soaked in drama. Diego's tragedy of losing a twin brother at the age of 2 was echoed by that of Frida, who suffered from polio at the age of 6 and who at 18 miraculously survived a bus accident but remained forever handicapped. Through what alchemy did the flamboyant Frida and the imposing Diego form such a charismatic couple that appeared to be straight out of a Hollywood movie? Was not the foundation of their couple to be found in their joint and unconditional passion for painting? Propelled by Frida mania since the 1990s, the dazzling Frida has by now passed by her illustrious husband, leaving him in the position of an artist and painter of the past. But she too has paid an unfair price. Her artwork, her vision of art, and her painting have today been eclipsed by her looks, her image, and the story of her physical suffering. But to grasp the power and sensitivity of her work, we must be able to get a handle on Frida in her entirety.
I believe that those passionate about Frida ought to read her diary to connect her paintings and her writing. It would allow them to understand her psychological makeup, her obsessions, and her own identity as they are sketched in her everyday text. And also the evolution of her relationship with Diego and the way she commented on her inner world, which she depicted in her art.
I say Frida Kahlo, the human being, must have realized the full existence of her body through the facts of life. I say Frida Kahlo, the woman, opened her body and expressed what she felt in it. What she felt was so violent that had she not tried to grasp it, identify it, then put it in order, I say she could have gone mad.
In her tumultuous and complicated life, she was able to transcend her physical pain through lively, colorful artwork. So we can say that this alliance of fascinating, original, and deep artwork that is not pretentious, with an unbelievable private life, shows us all the richness of that life.
The passionate love between Frida and Diego was first of all a mystery that really stood out. Their physical appearances were so different that their families compared them to a dove and an elephant.
The sentence was from Frida's mother. Diego was a huge man, almost 6'4", and Frida was small, 5 feet tall, and very thin. And she was in her 20s, while he was much older, and this was his third marriage.
She was no longer such a dove. Well, she was a dove by her size and by her physical appearance. He was an elephant also by his height. But was she really such a dove after she had already experienced such difficult things in life? At the corner of the San Juan market, a tram hit us, drove into us, hooked onto us. It was not a collision, more like a long devouring process. I remember this absurd, unreal slowness. The tram had crashed into a wall, and the autobus was contracting, folding into itself, compressing. I was not scared. Everything was so absurd that I couldn't be scared. Then suddenly, the world exploded. And a second or a century later, I was a dancer covered in blood and gold. I was not hurting at all because I was detaching from life.
But Frida would survive the horror. Her spine, legs, and pelvis fractured, with the steel rod perforating her abdomen. Unimaginable suffering which she would overcome by forming a character of steel and an unquenchable lust for life.
After her accident, she was immobilized for several months. Her mother had to find ways of keeping her occupied, of taking her mind off all she had to endure and all the heavy medical treatment. So she began to paint.
Frida, the miracle survivor, also had a lot of nerve. For example, one day in 1928, she stood in front of Diego Rivera's scaffolding while he painted a fresco at the Ministry of Public Education. She called out and demanded that he give his opinion of her paintings, as she recalled in her diary.
I stunned him. He looked at the paintings, 3 unforgiving self-portraits, sensitive, perhaps sensual. At least that's what he thought, because he tried giving me a series of compliments. but I immediately interrupted him. Enough compliments. I want serious criticism. He wanted to see the rest of my paintings and of me.
Diego the seducer soon fell for daring Frida's beauty and personality.
I believe they really had a great romance. They admired each other, and maybe this is a fundamental part of love.
There were no doubt two very charismatic persons. She was a young woman with already a lot of personality. She had her youth, and maybe that was attractive to this man who was 20 years older, and those 20 years might have been attractive to her too. And this big man, this elephant and big toad, could be reassuring.
Their passion quickly inflamed them, and soon, on August 21st, 1929, barely a year after they met, the elephant married the dove. But their marriage left many skeptical.
Unlike the mother, who said, "It is an elephant with a dove," the father warned Diego, "Don't be surprised. This woman is a demon. I advise you not to marry her." Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera cannot be understood without being in the context of the Mexican Revolution and the emergence of a whole host of artists.
Following 10 years of coups, of armed conflict between factions that shook and bloodied Mexico between 1910 and 1920, Mexican artists were being nourished by winds of freedom that had been kept from them for too long.
This Mexican Revolution brought forward the indigenous people, well, all that is Indian, after they had been, of course, crushed for a long time by successive regimes.
There was real contempt for our culture, our pre-Hispanic art, and our popular arts. The revolution brought a new political regime with more social aspirations.
And Mexican intellectuals and artists brought all this Mexican culture to the front line.
They were idealists who thought the time had come to create a new Mexico, and that art had to play a major role in this change.
The leader of this new political direction was the Minister of Education and Culture, José Vasconcelos. He brought together the three most influential artists in the country, calling them the Big Three: Siqueiros, Orozco, and of course Diego Rivera. He assigned them the mission of teaching the entire country Mexico's glorious history.
Mexico was a country where very few people were literate. And the idea of Vasconcelos was to use walls to spread the revolutionary message.
Within the National Palace of Mexico, which was government headquarters, Diego Rivera took over huge walls for his massive naive frescoes. He wanted everyone to have access to them. He depicted and glorified the ingenuity and organization of Aztec cities. He traced the bloody periods of Spanish colonization until the beginning of the 1930s. And in this revolutionary fervor, Frida was present. In her own way, she participated.
Frida was convinced that mural painting was a perfect communications and learning tool for society. She thought so but could not participate because she did not have the physical ability to paint large frescoes. She had always defined herself as an easel painter. Although Frida admired pre-Hispanic culture, her true passion was popular art. She traveled throughout the Republic looking for these wonderful regional textiles. She collected them, bought them, and created new ones. Because her mother was a great seamstress, she could make her own clothes. She also collected more than 450 religious articles, which very much influenced her art and are exhibited in the rooms of the Blue House. The popular religious articles were works of art that went together with Frida's paintings. They strongly influenced her work, especially in the messages she wrote at the bottom of her paintings, and in the somewhat innocent and naive composition style in some of them. She wanted to show that her subconscious came from pre-Hispanic art, but also from popular arts, that they were her very essence and the very essence of the collective imagination constantly reflected in her paintings.
A deep attachment to Mexican identity tied Diego and Frida together intimately, an attachment that had begun in childhood. For Diego, it began with the Indian nanny who took up the role of his mother, incapable of raising him after the death of her twin brother. For Frida, the learning came from her father.
Guillermo Kahlo was a man who still carried a sense of exile with him. Although he was the official photographer for the Mexican government for a time and photographed Mexican monuments.
She was very close to her father, so she had this opportunity to discover, to watch a country's richness through her father's eyes.
Thanks to her father's influence, Frida was curious, eager to know things, very bold. She did not accept social barriers.
Through his frescoes, Diego dedicated himself to bringing down social barriers in this post-revolutionary era in Mexico. One of his most beautiful accomplishments was undoubtedly the series of frescoes in the chapel of the Autonomous University of Chapingo in Mexico City's suburbs.
Chapingo was an emblematic place for the state born of the revolution, because it was about creating a university to educate peasants. The two levers of this social revolution were workers and peasants. In that sense, the fresco was dedicated to germination, to creation, and to life.
Through a magnificent allegory, Diego compared the uprising of the peasant world and work in the fields. His message was that harmony can only be reached by liberated men cultivating the land.
He talked about what made Mexico powerful. He said that this power resided in its land, in the depths of its lions, and that this idea had to be developed. Diego explored this theme for several years. The topic of many paintings is this country, the Mexico that needs to look within for its strengths and its values, to return to the very essence of Mexicans and their original culture.
Diego's work at the time could already be counted in hundreds of square meters of frescoes. I'm not saying that this proved his talent, but it did prove a capacity of work, a kind of Mexican Michelangelo. That is how I would define him. Impressive.
More than anyone else, Frida realized the size of the gargantuan mission to which Diego had devoted himself. As a woman madly in love, as a thoughtful lover, as a wife very proud of the man of her life, she accepted blending into his shadow.
It very often happened that one partner in the couple was completely obscured by the other.
She was the wife of this painter, and a beautiful original woman whom everyone noticed. But indeed, I think that there were many moments where she stepped to the sideline as a person, and even as a painter, of course. In the painting where Frida depicted her couple, we could really see the elephant and the dove. We see an imposing man with a punch holding his painter's palette. He is the painter. He is the one holding the palette, and she is the beloved wife. It is a painting of love.
But did Diego's imposing shadow influence even Frida's paintings?
She was influenced in her first paintings, of course. In the bus or the little girl paintings, yes, I think Diego has rubbed off on me a little. I depict my subjects with too much education in mind. But in my second self-portrait, in which I stand in front of a balcony with a pile of books, I feel that I am starting to pick up the thread of my prior work, and that I am beginning to make my own way.
Diego never crushed Frida, and Frida never imitated Diego. Instead, they helped each other.
They stimulated each other more than influencing each other.
They had a codependent relationship. Diego needed Frida. He knew she was his best critic.
Frida's artistic independence from her famous husband could be found in the colors of her palette.
Frida did a very interesting analysis of color. Red represented blood and suffering, while blue represented beauty, calm, and hope. She gave meaning to each color. Diego Rivera chose color over composition. He used Mexican color symbolism, while Frida researched the very meaning of the colors.
In 1930, Diego and Frida had been living their passionate love for a year, and Diego's fame went beyond Mexico's borders. He received large orders in the United States and gave in to the American dream. The couple moved to San Francisco.
They were very enthusiastic about going to the United States. It seems that Diego Rivera adapted very well there. He liked this life that went from artists to high society and welcomed it majestically. Frida had fun with it, and she played along, but she was a harsh critic of the United States and of Americans. Diego caused a sensation. He liked the United States, and the US liked him. Under chandeliers and photographers' flashes, he felt comfortable. At parties, these ladies with haircut in notches were all around him, even when he blew smoke from his big cigar in their furs. In any case, they would only find him more charming. Oh, Diego, you're a genius. What a wonderful man, really. Some fawned over him ridiculously. Had he been still uglier, my Diego, they would have loved him even more.
Frida became Frida in the United States. She consciously created her own character.
I think at that moment, Frida made an important discovery. She analyzed American society in contrast to our Mexican society.
In the painting, along the border between Mexico and the United States, in which there is a kind of division between her beloved Mexico and this industrial United States, we feel that she wants to cross the border again and go back to Mexico, I think.
Frida perceived this industrial modernness like something decadent, a modernness where human values were lost. She saw the contrast, and it was reflected in her work of this period. As for Diego, when he discovered this industrial world, he analyzed it as a modern phenomenon.
Fascinated by this American modernness, Diego agreed in 1931 to a request for a fresco for the brand new entrance hall to the Detroit Art Institute. The artwork was financed by automobile industry magnate Henry Ford, who also opened the doors of his factory to Diego.
Diego was keen on technological progress, and I think it was in the Detroit mural that this passion bloomed. In the bottom part, he presented the industry the way he perceived it, but the industrial process he painted is not exactly the same as in reality. In his imagination, Diego mixed the production stages.
But at the same time, there was always reflection on the past. He incorporated, for instance, the figure of Coatlicue, who's the goddess of life and death, as part of the machinery. He transformed it completely, but it is simply the same composition.
But he especially emphasized the way man makes technology go forward, and in return how technology transforms man. It was really a discourse on technological evolution. Then, in the middle part of the mural, he depicted the earth, and higher up, the earth richness, like a voice that speaks, that vibrates, and brings out the hands of the workers.
But this American exile that captivated and thrilled Diego was for Frida punctuated with suffering. After a first miscarriage during their stay in San Francisco, she suffered another in Detroit.
Diego Rivera was a painter who looked outward. Frida looked inward to paint. And this is where she acquired her importance in art history. She is the only example of a female painter who expressed everything that a woman can feel in her life. It went from the nightmare of losing a child to the desire of having a child. She could paint all the phases of love. She could paint a quarrel, she could paint a symbiotic relationship. Frida was a mirror reflecting everything a woman could feel in her life, even if she were not a painter, and if she were not Frida Kahlo.
In Frida Kahlo's work, there are two major categories of self-portraits. There is the classic self-portrait, where she represents herself at the forefront and decorates herself like a symbolic element loaded with meaning. And there is the self-portrait that depicts crucial moments in her life. We cannot say that Frida's self-portrait with monkeys is the same as a few stab wounds. In her classic self-portraits, there are recurring characteristics. The background is always very dark, with very thick clouds. Her palette, sometimes very intense, in whites and grays, brings to the forefront a face always adorned with colorful, traditional Mexican elements, making it stronger. For her, every detail has its importance as a part of the final tableau. So I believe there are two different style lines in her self-portraits.
Consider that in the history of painting, there are few portraits. Real ones, I mean. People who, as they paint a face, violently show you what is behind it. This work is about psychological penetration. With Frida, nothing that could be painted slips away. Everything is there, striking. We can see far into the person, and his or her presence touches you in your deepest inner being. Diego Rivera.
She dared to paint things such as a miscarriage or a cesarean. Today, that can still shock us very much, so you can imagine back then. If she had had the pretension of being a great artist, maybe she would not have painted these pictures. This wonderful painting in the Henry Ford Hospital is for me one of the most striking works of art. It was not ordinary for a woman to paint her intimate scenes and the most dramatic moments of her life as clearly as what photographs can show. That could sometimes be perceived as aggressive to traditional viewers.
And this miscarriage was obviously very violent, and she depicted it herself lying on the bed, as if all of her organs were spilling out of her. But as always with Frida, she put the torn-up pieces back together. She had this faculty with the things that ripped apart her life, such as accidents or love, to recompose things. Painting these scenes was a way of putting things back in order.
But for Frida, Rebuilding herself after this ordeal she experienced in the flesh was not all that she had to put back in order. Diego had left her. He was probably paralyzed by Frida's pain, but also humiliated as an artist after the Americans had heaped so much praise on him. In 1933, he painted a fresco at Rockefeller Center in New York with a portrait of Lenin instead of that of a Union representative. It was a huge scandal. The fresco was destroyed and ongoing orders were canceled. The couple went back to live in Mexico. Diego had built in the San Angel district, 5 kilometers from the Blue House, a villa with 2 buildings connected by a walkway. It was a symbol of the distance between the lives of the couple. Diego's romantic estrangement made it even more painful for Frida to deal with the tacit agreement the couple had. She had never ignored Diego's extramarital affairs with his models, his assistants, and admirers in the early days of their marriage. But they had made it a rule: side romances would not put cracks in the passion they had for each other.
Diego loved women, right or wrong. Did he need all this talk, let's say, about sexual feminine ways to be what he was? Perhaps. But Diego had a lust for life. And with this lust for life, of course, he also loved sensuality. And at times, Frida also had adventures, but without ever visibly shedding doubt on the couple.
She did have lovers in the United States. She'd been very involved with Nicholas Murray at that point. She went with many other people, even women.
She allegedly had a relationship with Josephine Baker, a liaison with Georgia O'Keeffe, and also with Cartier-Bresson, and even with Trotsky. She was a free woman. Some could say that she was leading a dissolute life, but I would rather say that death constantly hovered around her, and these love affairs were a way for her to keep her grasp on life.
Holding on to life also meant opening up to the world, including the doors of the Blue House. The couple's residence became a real refuge which welcomed with open arms all kinds of intellectuals and artists.
There were artists coming from all across the world, such as Cartier-Bresson, Isao Noguchi, or André Breton. They would come to see what was happening in a country that was just emerging from a revolution, and that was neither Europe nor the United States, but rather an exotic country.
But the artistic and intellectual excitement now surrounding the couple was not enough to save Diego and Frida's romantic passion. Diego went too far in his infidelity and committed a final betrayal that provoked something unimaginable. In December 1939, after a 9-year union, Diego and Frida divorced.
He had an affair with Frida's sister, Cristina. First, Cristina should not have done this either, obviously. Well, perhaps it was the attraction of this great man, of all he represented. Was it vengeance against her sister? I don't think so. Because Frida was still very attached to Cristina's children. All these people lived together, one street away from each other. So we don't know why this happened, but obviously for Frida, it was something terrifying. You never understood who I am. I am love, pleasure, essence. I am a bitch, an alcoholic. I am tenacious. I am a painter. I am simply who I am. But you, who are you? What should I do about all your insults? Continue to believe, like an idiot, in all your crap? Should I believe that you are God?
After this violent breakup, Frida directed all her energy towards her art and work. Her first official exhibit in New York was a success. Poet André Breton said about her that her art is a ribbon around a bomb. Fascinated by her paintings, which he qualified as surrealist, he invited her to come do an exhibit in Paris during an event he was organizing with Mexico as the theme in January 1939. Frida took the opportunity to try to free herself from Diego's hold on her.
I think she was expecting a lot of her trip to Paris. She was looking for new spaces and new people who would finally allow her to be Frida Kahlo.
She arrived in France and was disappointed because she found the French to be too intellectual. Concerning this surrealist world she was brought into, she found it overrated and rather self-absorbed. She did not like it at all. They have so many bloody, rotten intellectuals that I cannot stand them anymore. They're really too much. I'd rather sit on the ground at the Toluca market and sell tortillas than have anything to do with these artistic jerks from Paris.
She thought she would live the same experience in Paris as Diego, that she would take the same path to find herself and assert herself in her artistic style.
Frida's disappointment was even worse because for Diego, 2 decades earlier, life in Paris had been a key moment full of encounters.
Diego had discovered Paris much earlier than Frida. He had made acquaintances that transformed his outlook on what it was possible to do in art, about how far one could go. Diego had gotten to know the artists' quarter of Montparnasse.
He was among the important artists of the Paris school. He was in direct contact with Fujita, Picasso, and Modigliani. He did shows in galleries and was very active in the art market as well.
He was something like the Joker of the Montparnasse quarter of Paris. He was someone exotic in this Paris of artists. But in his private life, he did not have much money. He lived with Angelina Beloff, and in this misery, they lost a child who had been born after a full-term pregnancy, of course, whose name was Diego, Dieguito. He talked about him for a long time afterwards. In Paris, Diego found a certain cultural richness and cultural support for his painting, undoubtedly, but also misery.
Diego stayed close to 10 years in France from 1910 to 1920. In his quest for modernness in avant-garde Paris, he participated with Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris in the Cubist movement.
Diego Rivera established his own style of Cubism.
But we must note that Diego produced a completely different style of Cubism than that of the Europeans. If we look at the first Cubist paintings, it was almost all dirty palette Cubism. The color was somber, and Diego's colors were always bright.
Upon returning from Europe, Diego explained in his memoirs, "I went to Europe to look for what was not in me. And I came back from Europe to look for what was in me." These were not exactly his words, but that was the idea.
Frida, the Wild One, did not need Paris to fill a void in herself. It was recognition she had come to achieve by exhibiting her paintings.
Although I was the highlight of the exhibit, during the opening I stayed a bit to the side. Vasily Kandinsky congratulated me. He was so moved he cried, and his little glasses were full of mist. Juan Miro held me in his arms, with few words but much expression and affection. Max Ernst, always very cold but apparently sincere, told me to keep going. Picasso also took me in his arms and had lots of praise. Their recognition of my work touched me to the core, especially since I was being congratulated by some of the most important painters, and we know they do not offer praise easily. As a painter, she was increasingly legitimate, and she was there alone. For once, Diego was not by her side. So obviously it was important to know she could exist without Diego, without being in his shadow or in his presence. Paris gave her that.
Back in Mexico, Frida once again felt ripped apart and in pain because of her lost love. She immortalized this in one of her most beautiful paintings, The Two Fridas. Frida the bride and Frida the abandoned woman, but also Frida the fragile and Frida the warrior. In 1940, Frida went to the United States for treatment. The condition of her spinal column was worsening. Diego was there at the same moment.
He said something, as I remember, something like, "I saw her again, her pride is wounded, but her love is intact."
I love you more than my own skin. These words were Frida's. What she had not dreamed of happened. Diego asked her to marry him again. The second union was consecrated on December 8, 1940.
Perhaps Diego realized that Frida was physically fragile, and that not only could they not live without each other, but abandoning her at that moment was not easy to do.
I think their relationship had progressively changed over time. Frida's life had not been easy, especially in the past 3 years. She went through very painful moments and intense suffering. And I think that Diego was a good companion in this last stage.
The last years of Frida's life were very difficult. In 1950, she went through 7 surgical operations, one of which kept her in hospital for 9 months.
In 1953, Frida sank into a sea of pain. Already infected by polio, she developed untreatable gangrene in her leg, which was then amputated. Frida predicted that if she lost her leg, she would die.
So she painted, even in her wheelchair, missing a leg. But we know it was a Frida who was really hurting. She was screaming, crying, and yelling from pain, from despair. Frida was no longer well at all. I loved life intensely, as long as it was life. But now, in the name of what and whom should I endure all of this?
On July 13, 1954, Frida died from pulmonary embolism, congested lungs. At 47, she was freed of her unbearable suffering. These were the last words in her diary. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. For the last painting, she chose to depict watermelons.
After having been through more than 30 surgical operations, with her body in pieces, Frida produced a painting that she called Viva la vida, long live life, meaning I love life or I want to live. Despite everything, life was worth living. She depicted this in a painting with a watermelon that has the same colors as the Mexican flag, green, red, white.
Frida was alive, a survivor, and it is not at all surprising that her last painting has this for a name.
Diego outlived her by only 3 years. He passed away on November 24, 1957. He was 71 years old. As was Frida's, his funeral was a national affair. But despite what the two intense lovers wished, they do not lie next to each other. Frida's ashes are kept in the Blue House. Diego lies near other Mexican heroes in the Rotunda of Illustrious Men in the Dolores Pantheon.
I think that in the end, they lived a very deep love, very different from the love of a classic couple. They lived a love whose language was painting, and I believe that this was the most important element in their lives. Their last public image is a very painful one. It is a photograph of Diego and Frida at a demonstration just 4 days before Frida's death. It is a powerful photo. Pain is visible on Frida's face, as is her getting old prematurely due to her physical agony. And Diego appears as a very lonely, older man. I don't really like this photo. I prefer to remember their wedding photo, that of the elephant and the dove.